in that very same article, a piece was, comments were made about linguistics, and I emailed this person and said, well, what was your reference for this? And he said, oh, we have a book called so-and-so, it was written in 1940. And in the colonial period, Portuguese colonial period, and actually it was about Guinea-Bissau. You know, so it's, when you read these things, read them with a critical mind. Doesn't mean we have to all agree. Doesn't mean that at all. I'll give you another example of this, where I think that there's been insufficient debate, again, in biology. The concept of the coalescence time is the time by which you get back to the ancestor of a gene that has subsequently mutated and diversified. Now, we've all heard in the news, here or there, that modern humans left Africa 40, 50,000 years ago. This has been written. I didn't write this, other people wrote this. There's a particular haplogroup of mitochondrial DNA called the U haplogroup, found more commonly in Europe these days. Particular variants are found in northern Africans, especially northwest Africans. And this haplogroup is said to be 60 to 65,000 years old. Tironi in Italy, someone who I've had personal communications with, says, oh, he believes it's 60,000 years old. Now, if people only left Africa 40 or 50,000 years old, 40 or 50,000 years ago, and this haplogroup is 60,000 years old, it would have had to have arisen before people left Africa, right? I mean, it's logical, right? But if you look in the literature, you will see where it is, not uniformly, but usually said to be of Southwest Asian origin, that it has migrated back into Africa. But if people didn't leave until 50,000 years ago, then how could it have migrated back now? So when you read these things, when you read this kind of material, I think it's very important to bring a very critical eye and to understand that what they will tell you when you raise this question. Well, you know, the confidence intervals are very large. You know, the statistical thing gets trotted out. Confidence intervals are very large, 20,000 years on each way, so it could have been this. It still doesn't change the fact that because they're not seeing a lot of a particular haplogroup in Africa today, there is the idea that it couldn't have arisen there. Now, they are being scientific in the following sense. You know, I mentioned earlier the principle of greatest diversity, first developed by the botanist Vavilov, great Russian botanist who was persecuted, who talked about plant diversity as being suggestive of a region of locale, where you have the greatest diversity, that's likely to be a center of origin. But there's an exception. If you're doing genetic studies and you find the greatest diversity in a place, and your coalescence time tell you that there were no people there at that time, then you have to modify your hypothesis in the way you think. Also, there's the possibility that something arose in a particular place. There was rapid migration, so that the history of a particular gene or allele has been longest in a particular area. So that's true, but its place of origin is different. The field of science that would address this kind of thing is called biogeography, and that particular notion that I just described would be an example of dispersal biogeography. So there are many things to be discussed and to be thought about. This is not something that, if you want to talk about it in any place, that you should take lightly, and you should be extremely critical. You know, I don't have an ideological axe here, other than I dislike dishonesty and inconsistency. Now, crania, as you know, have been used to talk about where people come from, their ancestry, etc., and their race. All crania do is measure. I mean, when you do these craniometric studies, what you're determining is overall similarity. Okay, and the assumption is that if something is more similar to something else, that, and it's an essentialist notion, that it must come from the same origin, and it must be closely related. It's the basis of all forensic thinking, what have you. So in a study done by W.W. Howells, Cranial Variation Man, 1973, using this method, clustering by successive mergers, and so methods differ. So in this method, you start with the two that are most similar, and then you link in gradually all of the others. Egypt in this case, and this is a late dynastic northern Egyptian series, clusters with a group of Europeans. Okay. When you use another method, it clusters in tropically, oddly enough, first with some folks from the Andaman Islands, and then with other tropical people, in this case all from Africa. And it's not the first time that a study done on an Egyptian series when they've included material from either the Andaman Islands or from Australia, that an Egyptian series or crania will cluster with things from that region. We don't really think that they came from the Andaman Islands, and we don't really think that they came from Australia. But again, we're talking about gross anatomical similarity. If you work from an evolutionary model, and you make the assumption that modern people left Africa, a subset of people from northeastern Africa, as some sort of generalized human, then this is perfectly reasonable. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that using different methods, you can even get different results. If you plot these in 2 dimensions from the Sherman analysis technique analysis that was also used, the Egyptians plot between Europeans and deep tropical Africans. And so one should not be surprised at this shifting back and forth. Earlier Egyptians, like the Badarians and the Nakata, depending on your comparative material, will cluster with tropical Africans, and I include Somalis and Nubians in that, or they will cluster with North Africans, Berbers, and so what have you, or they will cluster with Near Eastern as well. The brachial index is just a comment on the relationship between the distal forelimb and the upper arm. And when Lepsius talks about his canon, Lepsius, an Egyptologist, he's really describing these proportions. Well, there's a notion about a tropical body versus a non-tropical body. And when you look at the brachial indices, you see that the Nakata and Badarian Egyptians, at least in terms of their arm ratios, along with other material from, for example, Somalia, Afro-Tafarol, they all kind of cluster together. Extreme tropical, you get extreme numbers, more extreme numbers, for Wadi Halfa, from the Batwa, so-called pygmy people, Algerian Copper Age people, which is very interesting to me, considering how far north Algeria is, and that I believe that there's been migration back and forth in that area. Afro-Americans kind of sit between Euro-Americans and West Africans. I don't have that here. The Tufians have an elongated leg, upper distal forearm. And then as you get to colder climates and people, Inuit, Yugoslavia, you get lower numbers. You cannot put absolute stock in this because there is variation in every part of the world, but it's a general trend observed both for humans and animals. This is a little, this slide illustrates the septal aperture, which is a hole in the distal humerus related to, some people used to think it used to be related to function. Some people think that it's genetics. But in any case, I believe that it's genetic, usually because you can find it in infants. So infants have not had enough time to be out working to develop it. The frequency of septal aperture frequencies is very striking because in Northeast Africa, you've got this huge clump that all very high frequencies, 50%, 40%, 43%. And then when you come to other groups of people, and I've just quoted material from the slides, it was an old paper written in the 40s. They talked about African Negroes, 21%. Somali had something like 52%. Japanese, 15%. Whites born in the USA, 5.2%. Quote, all whites, 6.9%. All that's cool. So there is something very interesting about this Northeast Africa and over Northern Africa. The septal aperture has a very high frequency there.